Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation. One story at a time. How many times have you heard the phrase, "The poor suffer because they want to"? Well, this video is about to turn that idea upside down. In the middle of one of the worst heat waves of the decade, while mansions sealed their windows with state-of-the-art air conditioners, an entire community was forgotten under a blazing 45-degree C sun. Children fainting, elderly people with burns, and no help in sight. But in the midst of the chaos, one ordinary man did what no authority dared to do. He acted. He wasn't a politician, an influencer, or the leader of an NGO. He was Eduardo, a former construction worker with calloused hands, a few worn-out tools, and a heart that couldn't stand to see anyone else suffer. While everyone else ran, he built. While others complained, he acted. While others forgot, he cared. And this story, my friend, will show you that dignity can't be bought. It must be built. With humility, with action, and with respect. Get ready. This isn't a common story. It's a slap in the face for those who think nothing can be done without money, fame, or political support. Here you'll witness the silent revolution of a man who built more than a shelter. He raised awareness, mobilized a city, and left behind a legacy that not even the most extreme heat could erase. And after watching this, I promise, you'll never look at an invisible person the same way again. The heat was almost unbearable, the kind that makes asphalt feel like it's melting beneath your feet. In the city's wealthy zones, generators buzzed like anthems of privilege. But in the forgotten neighborhoods, the soundscape was different. Silence, groans, or at best, the dry whir of broken fans. In moments like this, the stories that emerge split between comfort and survival. While some sipped champagne in air-conditioned rooms, others sought shade beneath tattered tarps. And that's when you realize, the real problem isn't just the weather, it's the gap in priorities. Walking through those communities, you feel the urgency in your skin. Children with heat stroke, elderly people fainting in plastic chairs, animals panting in the shade of crumbling walls. And the government? Gone. No water trucks, no emergency tents, not even hollow promises of help. In those moments, the city splits between those with an escape plan and those with only faith. And the stories from these streets don't make the evening news, but they carry lessons more valuable than any headline. It's strange how a tragedy can expose what was already broken. It wasn't the heat wave that collapsed the city. It was chronic neglect. People dying from heat just a few meters from stocked refrigerators. The math doesn't add up. And maybe that's why, every now and then, someone shows up who doesn't wait for a decree or spotlight. Someone who understands that dignity can't be outsourced. And that's where the story begins to shift direction, like an unlikely breeze in the middle of a desert. In that arid setting, Eduardo appeared, 62 years old, calloused hands, a calm gaze, and a drive that couldn't fit into any climate emergency report. A former builder, a widower, a resident of a neighborhood forgotten by both City Hall and the press, but with something the sun couldn't burn away: purpose. While many crossed their arms waiting for help, he grabbed his tools, some scrap wood, and a worn-out tarp. Right there alone, he began a new story. The first structure was simple: 2 wooden beams, a makeshift roof, and plastic bottles filled with frozen water hanging from the edges. But it was enough to shelter 3 elderly women and a young man who could barely breathe. Eduardo didn't talk much. He just did. It was as if every hammer strike said, "If no one else will care, I will." This wasn't charity. It was respect. And the most beautiful part? He wasn't looking for gratitude, just shade. And maybe that's why the story began to echo among his neighbors. Sometimes what's missing in the world isn't resources, it's initiative. And Eduardo had plenty. Using leftover wood from an abandoned site, he began to build a real shelter. A higher roof, a rest area, space for cold water, even fans powered by phone batteries and solar panels that a neighbor thought were useless. While the news spoke of collapse, there was a new kind of resistance being born there, one made of humility, ingenuity, and courage. But what came next, no one could have imagined. What began as an improvised shelter became a true oasis of humanity. Eduardo, with the precision of someone who had built towers and dreams for decades, started refining every detail. Nothing there was accidental. The chairs were clean, the wet cloths changed every hour, water buckets carefully placed. It was as if he were saying, "Shade cools the body, but care refreshes the soul." And anyone who stepped inside felt it. This wasn't charity. It was dignity, a new story, rising under a tarp. But the most impressive part wasn't the structure, it was his gaze. Eduardo looked the elderly in the eye, asked the children's names, remembered to bring a dry towel for the boy in the wheelchair. Anyone who passed through stopped being needy and became human again. And that, strangely enough, was rarer than the shelter itself. Because some things can't be provided by any government. Empathy. And in that little patch of shade, the stories of those people were being told again, with dignity. Someone might say it was too small a gesture for such a catastrophe, but only those who've never needed a simple act in a desperate moment would think that. As one elderly man said while reclining pain-free for the first time, "Here I'm not just alive, I exist." And those whispered phrases were what started drawing other eyes to the place, including someone who would change the entire course of this story. While the heat pressed on and the authorities stayed silent, a young journalism student walked through the community. He wasn't an experienced reporter, nor was he chasing headlines, just a boy with a camera on his chest and sensitivity in his eyes. He wandered without hurry, curious about what the news never covered. He expected to find the usual: abandonment, scarcity, silence. But as he turned the corner of a narrow alley, his eyes stopped on Eduardo's shelter. They stopped like someone finding stillness in a rushing world. He approached slowly, didn't want to interfere, just observed. He respectfully photographed the details: the plastic bottle turned humidifier, the elderly woman sleeping peacefully on a stretched cloth, the makeshift fan humming like a silent hope. He also captured Eduardo's serene face as he adjusted a blanket while whispering to a child. And then, with a caption as simple as it was powerful, he posted, "While the rich flee to air conditioning, this man built dignity with his own hands." That's how one more of those stories that needed to be told came to life. In a few hours, the post exploded. Social media, so often an amplifier of nonsense, for once amplified something essential. The image crossed the walls of the community like a breeze on a stifling day. Thousands of likes, shares by major pages, emotional comments from people who didn't even know where the place was but felt the urgency in Eduardo's gesture. They asked how to help, if there was a fundraiser, if they could donate tarps, water, fans. Suddenly, the outside world saw another world, one that had always existed but had never been lit up. One of those stories that only gain voice when someone dares to listen. And Eduardo? Still the same, silent, as if he already knew the value of what he did wasn't measured in views. He knew the internet forgets quickly, but the dignity he provided wouldn't fade. He kept collecting wet cloths, adjusting the coverings, offering cold water with his own hands. No posing, no vanity, just consistency. And that's why the image went so viral, because it overflowed with truth. And truth, when captured with respect, becomes fuel for more stories to be born. Soon journalists started looking for the place. Some came with cameras and microphones, others with just notebooks and teary eyes. Influencers shared the students' post with captions like, "The Brazil that resists, a lesson in humanity," or "an example worthy of national news." Doctors were moved by Eduardo's ingenuity and sent boxes of first aid supplies. Urban engineers analyzed the photos and said they saw in the shelter's improvisation smarter solutions than many expensive public projects. Another one of those stories where grassroots wisdom outshines cold diplomas. The shelter became a symbol, but Eduardo didn't get swept up in it. He simply looked up, nodded humbly at those who arrived, and went back to arranging the chairs. He declined long interviews, didn't want fame, told the young journalist, "The shade I offer doesn't need applause and only respect." That was it. His greatness was invisible to eyes addicted to spectacle, and maybe that's why that image struck so deep, because the stories that truly mark us don't scream, they whisper awareness. But that image would still echo. More than likes, it inspired action. People with tools, time, and willingness came. Days later, a volunteer architect arrived with a simple passive ventilation plan. A retired carpenter brought reclaimed wood. A group of scouts donated strong new tarps from a local factory. A street artist painted a mural with the caption from the viral post. Around it, he drew interlocked hands protecting a tree. The art became another of those quiet stories that give meaning to the landscape. Over time, what started as an improvised shelter became a meeting place. Children spent their afternoons there, telling stories and hearing Eduardo's. Young volunteers started a reading workshop. A retired teacher held tutoring sessions for kids who'd missed school because of the heat. And the most curious thing, No one was ordered to be there. No one came for vanity. They came because something in that initial scene, dignity built with bare hands, had awakened a long-forgotten sense of responsibility. It became a chain of stories, all connected by one powerful thread: belonging. The young journalist, the one who made the original post, returned to the site weeks later. He was greeted with a hug. He saw how much the place had grown. He took more photos. But this time, he didn't publish anything. He said he now understood. Some stories aren't meant to explode on the internet. They're meant to nourish the soul of those who are present. And this time, he just wanted to be present. He talked with the children, helped serve water, held the ladder while a volunteer electrician installed a new roof structure. He smiled, realizing that, unintentionally, his post was merely the first step in something far greater. And perhaps more beautiful than going viral was seeing that Eduardo hadn't changed, still calm, attentive, consistent. The city hall, of course, showed up later, tried to take the credit, promised investment, installed a sign calling the place the city's emergency shelter. Eduardo didn't comment. He kept tending to the details. The people who knew the truth knew. The shelter wasn't born from a decree. It was born from compassion. And that's the true origin of the stories that bring real change. They don't begin with speeches. They begin with actions. Today, that shelter still stands strong. It's not just a place to escape the heat. It's a living monument to respect. When newcomers ask, "Who built this?" the answer is always the same. The community did, inspired by Eduardo. And if you go there, you'll still see the hanging bottle, the humming fan, the carefully hung sheet. But you'll also see something a photo can't capture: the collective heartbeat of a place where dignity was reinvented amid scarcity, a place where stories are told through actions, not polished words. The video spread so widely that it began to disturb people's consciences. Those who once pretended not to see could no longer look away. The heat remained merciless, but the impact of that simple gesture, creating a shelter with shade and dignity, had begun to spark something more powerful than any fan: reflection. The next day, a volunteer doctor arrived with a first aid kit and an open heart. Soon after came 2 more colleagues, then an engineer with ideas for water capture, then a group of young people with tools, energy, and a hunger to be part of something bigger. No one was paid, no one was ordered. Everyone just added what they could. It was as if Eduardo's initiative had unlocked a new logic, the logic of we take care of each other. And these stories that arise from the collective always carry more strength than any emergency ordinance, because they're not born from commands, they're born from empathy. And when empathy replaces neglect, the world becomes a far more livable place. Eduardo kept his feet on the ground and his gaze on others. He declined praise, avoided improvised stages, and never allowed his name to be printed on banners. It's not about me, it's about them, those who were left under the sun for days. He'd repeat like a mantra, and maybe that's why his gesture struck so deeply. He reminded the world that you don't need to be a hero, you just need to be human. And in an age of inflated egos, that was revolutionary. One of those stories. We tell our children to teach them what character really is. The shelters became sturdier, the tents more stable, and the donations began to include diapers, coconut water, and thin blankets. A group of architects proposed new improvements, but Eduardo insisted on keeping everything functional, direct, and simple. Comfort, yes. Excess, no. Because at the end of the day, what he wanted was for people to have what he had always longed for in life: dignity. And it was at that exact moment that something unexpected appeared behind an official car. It was the city's urban planning secretary, surrounded by cameras and rehearsed speeches. In his hands, a paper project claiming to revolutionize emergency response in the suburbs. Eduardo listened politely, but when they asked him to sign a partnership, he simply pointed to an elderly woman sitting in the corner, hands swollen and face burned by the sun. "Talk to her first. If the project works for her, it might work for us." The secretary stammered, looked away, gave a weak smile, and left. Another one of those stories where power is disarmed by truth. The following week, a nearby public school opened space for logistical support. Teachers showed up offering literacy classes for children out of school. A group of musicians began playing guitar in the late afternoons. And the shelter became more than a shelter. It became a symbol, not just of resistance to heat, but of resistance to neglect. Because behind the tarps and damp cloths there was a philosophy: no one gets left behind. These stories born of adversity have the gift of reminding us what truly matters. A local community radio began broadcasting daily bulletins with shelter updates. The number of volunteers doubled, but Eduardo remained in the same corner, adjusting the sheets to block the sun, picking up discarded cups, embracing the elderly with care. He never wanted positions, selfies, or headlines. He just wanted no one else to be treated as invisible. And maybe that's why so many people finally saw him. His stories started being shared on social media, in universities, in community talks, as an example of silent but powerful leadership. One day, an international journalist came to do a story. She wanted to know the secret. Eduardo pointed to a 12-year-old boy handing out damp towels to the elderly with a huge smile on his face. "He's the secret, and her, and him too," he said, pointing around. "I just took the first step. The rest is collective work." The journalist cried, because she understood what 1,000 headlines couldn't explain. Some stories can't be told with words. They must be felt with the heart. And it was precisely this collective heart that began to inspire other neighborhoods. Small replicas of the shelter began popping up in distant communities. A group of young people from another city came to learn and replicate the model. And just like scattering seeds to the wind, Eduardo watched his idea sprout in places he had never been. The power of a story doesn't lie in who starts it, but in who keeps it going. And this one kept growing, strong and ever-expanding. Despite all the attention, Eduardo refused every attempt to make him a personal symbol. He said a phrase that became a motto painted on one of the shelter's walls: "I don't want to be remembered. I want them to be remembered." That echoed, and it began to change even those who used to just walk by. Shopkeepers began donating ice, pharmacies, sunscreen, small acts, big impacts. The stories that arise from everyday life are the most powerful, because they don't need a show, just truth. And then came the most symbolic moment of all. An 8-year-old girl with colorful braids and worn flip-flops stood on an improvised crate and, with a firm voice, asked to speak. She said that there, she learned what it means to care, to share, to respect. And she asked that no one leave when the heat wave was over, because we might lose the shade, but real kindness stays forever. The crowd applauded. Eduardo cried. And one more story was born, perhaps the most beautiful of all. The days went on. The heat faded. The media left. But the shelter remained, reinvented, adapted, sustained with the same spirit. Eduardo is still there, among water buckets and damp cloths, speaking calmly, guiding with empathy. And when people ask if he regrets not accepting the spotlight, he smiles and points to a group of young people now leading the space. They are my answer. Because those who plant real stories don't harvest applause, they harvest awareness. He arrived surrounded by cameras, aides, and promises. A local politician, known for disappearing during crises and appearing in photo ops, came to visit Eduardo's shelter. Wearing a white shirt with the top buttons open, campaign smile, expensive cologne, and rehearsed speech. Before greeting anyone, an aide was already adjusting the camera angle, another fixing the lighting, and a communication team had the caption ready: "Standing in solidarity in difficult times." But what he didn't expect was to find a place where marketing couldn't survive, only respect. He had barely stepped into the makeshift shelter when phones were already being raised to record. He struck poses, shook hands absent-mindedly, waved to the cameras like a celebrity on a red carpet. But Eduardo, calm as always, interrupted the performance with a gesture that dismantled the entire act. He placed a bucket of water in the politician's hands and kindly, yet firmly, like someone who knows exactly where he stands, asked him to help cool down the elderly. A simple, human, direct request. No fancy words, just action. And at that moment, one of those stories was born, those unexpected but deeply felt ones. The politician laughed awkwardly, adjusted his shirt collar, and muttered something about urgent commitments. He turned on his heel and left just as quickly and artificially as he had arrived. His aides, stunned, turned off their phones. But the community didn't forget, because in that moment they understood that true representation isn't about badges or speeches. It's proven through action. And more than that, it's built in silence, in the makeshift shade of old tarps, in shared bottles of water, in the small acts that build dignity. Eduardo, who had never asked for a cent of public money, once again showed that true leadership doesn't need a microphone. It needs consistency. While politicians collected likes, he arranged chairs. While authorities handed out speeches, he handed out damp cloths. And that difference was clear. Because in the end, it's not the title that transforms. It's character. And there, between a wet towel and a child sleeping on a makeshift mattress, another one of those stories of resistance was born. The kind that never make the news, but forever mark those who witness them. The impact was immediate. Videos spread across social media with captions like, "Eduardo teaches how to govern, with a bucket in hand," or "Politician dodges water, but not shame." People commented, shared, laughed at the awkward moment, but most importantly, they reflected. How could a man with so little do so much, while those with everything do so little? That question crossed borders. It echoed through neighboring neighborhoods, in conversations in forgotten communities, on indie podcasts, on late-night radio shows, and even in the newspapers that had ignored the crisis. And from that wave, something even more beautiful began to happen. Because sometimes, a solitary act sparks collective fires. Community leaders from other neighborhoods began visiting the shelter to learn. Volunteers from distant areas arrived with whatever they could offer: used fans, granola bars, tarps, affection. Groups of students organized task forces to assess the needs of each resident. Universities, once distant from the reality of the poor, sent nursing and psychology interns to assist those in need. A new network was forming, a network of empathy, a network of action. More than providing answers, the shelter became a question, a giant question mark about the role of public power, about each citizen's responsibility, about what truly drives a community. Because the stories born there weren't just about heat, shade, or water. They were about awareness, about that internal click that happens when you realize you can't pretend not to see anymore, when the silence of the state becomes the cry of the people, when official neglect is replaced by popular courage. And Eduardo? He stayed the same. Unshaken by praise, unfazed by criticism. He simply kept doing. Because those with purpose don't wait for applause. They create meaning. And each of his actions became a lesson in humanity, in humility, in strength, and of course in consistency. A concept in danger of extinction out there, but a daily practice within the shelter. And the more people watched, the more they were inspired. Because that's how true stories spread, not by going viral but by spreading consciousness. Soon, residents proudly began saying, "We don't have a mayor here, we have Eduardo." And surprisingly, that wasn't a criticism of politics. It was praise for citizenship. Because instead of waiting for top-down solutions, they were building with their own hands what speeches failed to deliver. An elderly woman, sick from the heat, was helped by a group of teenagers who built a homemade cooling system with PET bottles and ice. A retired carpenter started making benches out of reclaimed wood. And so, without anyone realizing, a parallel city began to take shape. It wasn't a city of asphalt, traffic lights, or million-dollar budgets. It was a city of affection, a city where every gesture mattered, where the logic of profit was replaced by the logic of care, where time moved differently, slower, more human, more just. And that indeed was a revolution, a silent yet powerful revolution, a revolution without political flags but with clear values: respect, dignity, listening, solidarity. The stories born there were alive, beating, inspiring, and the effects of that transformation crossed state lines. In another state, a teacher showed the video of the politician dodging the bucket during an ethics class. At a cultural center, artists recreated the scene in a mural, Eduardo holding the bucket with the phrase, "Here, we lead with action, not with image." Even an international NGO became interested in documenting what was happening there, not out of charity but to learn. Because in the end, what Eduardo and his community were doing wasn't charity. It was education. They were teaching the country to remember the obvious, that people are not pawns. They are a transforming force. That crises aren't excuses for inaction. They are opportunities for unity. And that the greatest stories are born just like this, when no one's watching, when no one's paying, when no one's commanding. Simply when someone genuinely decides to care. And that is the exact moment when the magic happens. Eduardo didn't change the whole world, but he changed the world for many. And that, in itself, is enough. Because if each person did the same in their street, their neighborhood, their community. We might not have to wait for elections or miracles. It would be enough to act, to care, to recognize that every great transformation begins with a small gesture, with a bucket of water in hand, with shared shade, with an offered chair, with true listening, and with the courage to be an example, even when no one is applauding. What began with a hammer and a tarp became a movement. Inspired by Eduardo, neighbors began stepping out of their homes with buckets, old boards, empty bottles, and an urge that could no longer be contained. What was once just a makeshift shelter, built with love and urgency, now multiplied in alleys, sidewalks, and forgotten plazas. And the most beautiful part, no one waited for authorization, or plans, or funding. It was pure will to protect one another, born from a real, living, tangible story. When the example is true, it doesn't command, it inspires. The first alley became a shade point, the second a water station, the third an improvised rest area. And each of these efforts was driven not by luxury, but by dignity. Children began soaking cloths and hanging them on string lines. Teenagers organized water distribution lines with the care of someone who understood that caring for others is part of growing up. The elderly women gathered chairs, benches, and mats to create a quiet system of welcome. And even those who had nothing offered their presence. It was there that new stories were born. A young local artist named Layla began painting murals with simple phrases that seemed to shout, "Here there is respect. No one lets go of anyone's hand. Dignity is a freshness for the soul." The paintings blended anonymous faces, intertwined hands, and the sun being shaded by clouds of care. The art became a living mural, and each brushstroke was another form of resistance. It was impossible to pass by and not feel something shift, because those streets, so neglected on the outside, were being reborn from within. A new collective story was rising under the scorching sun. The heat remained relentless. Temperatures broke records and seemed to mock human resilience. The public authorities, silent, political promises, melted. But in the midst of it all, there was something no heat wave could evaporate: solidarity. And that word began to take physical shape. The shelters became more than just places of thermal refuge. They became spaces of exchange. A woman left fruits from her garden. A young man left toys for the children. A retired teacher began telling stories and teaching literacy, using letters drawn on the wall with charcoal. People who once avoided each other were now sharing the same bottle of water. Families who barely exchanged greetings now sat side by side to hear the advice of Dona Gloria, an elderly woman who had lost everything in a fire years ago, but never lost her faith. There, each patch of shade was more than relief. It was a symbol. And while the sun scorched the asphalt, something new was blooming. A rising awareness that maybe the entire city could be different. Maybe the wealthy neighborhoods could learn from the poor. Maybe what they call the periphery is actually the heart of a silent revolution, made of small stories of affection and justice. And it was from that collective strength that the invitations started arriving. Eduardo, who never sought the spotlight, was now being sought after. Universities wanted to hear him. NGOs wanted to honor him. Foundations wanted to recognize his gesture, but he humbly declined them all. Just as he had raised the first tarp, he would simply say, "If you want to honor me, build more shade. Create an emergency climate fund. Train young people to lead with heart, because the only tribute that matters is the continuation of the story." Some institutions truly understood the message. Inspired by Eduardo's shelter model, they began implementing sustainable urban versions in other regions. Leadership training programs were launched. Simple technologies, like reflective tarps, clay filters, and cross-ventilation, began to be discussed in conferences. What began with a hammer and a tarp was now a topic at international symposiums. And even so, Eduardo remained there, sitting in the shade, handing out water, organizing the line, saying with his eyes what many still can't say in words, that no transformation can last if it's not made with soul. The neighborhood, once a symbol of neglect, became a beacon of reinvention. People started visiting the community as if it were a museum of courage. But there were no static exhibits. There was life. There was movement. There was purpose. And every visitor left with more than heat. They left with unsettling questions. Why isn't the whole city like this? Why doesn't the government listen to those who understand survival best? How many stories are we ignoring by not looking around? Over time, the residents themselves created a local association to keep the shelters running. They organized care shifts, created an emergency fund with donations from small business owners, and even got support from a school to offer night classes in the cooler tents. It was education under canvas, citizenship in improvisation, and a reminder that where there is love, there is structure, even without bricks, pavement, or titles. Eduardo would say that shade was just the beginning, that the real relief was seeing a young person recognize their value, seeing an elderly woman feel safe, hearing a child say, "I like it here," because every patch of shade planted with dignity blossoms into belonging, and that's the root of all stories worth telling. Years later, one of the youths who started out carrying water buckets became an environmental engineer. One of the children who helped distribute wet cloths became a climate activist. The artist who painted the first murals was invited to exhibit in a capital city gallery, and they all said the same thing. It all started at the shelter, because that space was more than protection. It was a starting point, a cocoon, an incubator for dreams. Today, the movement lives on. Other neighborhoods copied the idea. Other cities created their own versions. But what no one has managed to replicate is the spirit, because the spirit of that village wasn't born from a project. It was born from urgency, born from care, born from real stories that emerge when pain meets someone who chooses to act. And that choice, my friend, remains the most powerful way to change the world. The invitations kept coming. After Eduardo's initiative gained notoriety, what had once been silence became a chorus. Universities wanted him at conferences. NGOs wanted to award him for social impact. Foundations proposed honors with his name engraved on golden plaques. It was as if, suddenly, everyone wanted to turn him into a symbol, when all he wanted was to remain a seed. Eduardo accepted the thanks with grace but declined the spotlight with a serenity that disarmed everyone. "If you really want to honor me," he said calmly, "create a permanent emergency climate fund for the outskirts." It wasn't pride, it was vision. And that's when many realized Eduardo didn't want to be remembered. He wanted people to act. He wanted new stories to be born. And some institutions really got the message. Praising him wasn't enough. They had to replicate what he had done. That's how urban shelter programs were born, based on Eduardo's improvised model. With tarps, shade, fresh water, and most importantly, respect, universities created research centers focused on resilient micro-infrastructures. NGOs offered technical and emotional training for community leaders. Foundations began funding low-cost projects with high human impact. All of it began with one quiet gesture, started alone with a hammer, some cloth, and a sincere desire not to let anyone melt in abandonment. Those stories stopped being exceptions. They became strategies. Meanwhile, Eduardo remained in the same place, caring for the shelter as if it were an extension of his own body, serving cold water to newcomers with the same attention he gave to adjusting the wet cloths on the roof. There was no rush, no vanity. To him, every gesture mattered, because for someone who had seen suffering up close, stamped on sunburnt faces, dignity wasn't just a pretty word, it was urgent. And that's what made his story so different from others. It didn't fade in recognition. It grew stronger in practice, in care, in the everyday. Once a reporter insisted, "Do you see yourself as a hero?" Eduardo laughed, scratched his beard, thought for a few seconds, and replied with a phrase that would mark generations. "A hero is someone who takes care of their mother with Alzheimer's alone. I just built some shade." Simple, but devastating. That line became a headline, a tattoo, a mural. Because in a world addicted to medals, he reminded us that the true giants live in silence. The phrase spread across social media, university billboards, posters at climate justice events. But Eduardo didn't change. He still walked there in flip-flops, sweeping the shelter floor before each new day began. To him, each shadow was a prayer, and each person welcomed was a new story unfolding. In time, other neighborhoods followed suit. Small towns started creating cooling islands amidst hot asphalt. Young activists wrote their theses based on concepts Eduardo never theorized, only lived. Not out of vanity, but conviction. A conviction that said the basics, when done with love and consistency, can be more revolutionary than 1,000 fiery speeches. And so, his story crossed borders. From the cracked concrete of the outskirts, it reached the world, without ever leaving the ground, because the roots were deep and needed no stage. Eduardo didn't collect awards. He collected thank yous, handwritten notes from children, voices shouting, "Thank you," from across the street, mothers who hugged him in tears, fathers who once distrusted him now brought donations. Everyone knew there was more than shade there. There was a silent pact of care, a commitment that didn't rely on the government or funding but on humanity. And that was the beauty of his story. It didn't ask permission to exist. It simply bloomed where light was most needed. Even so, deep down in his heart, he knew one final scene was still missing. Something more than a gesture, more than a beautiful phrase. Something that would last. Something that would withstand time, neglect, and broken promises. So he bought a can of white paint and, on one of the shelter's walls, he wrote with a thick, steady brush, "It's not just shade that brings relief, it's respect." He didn't ask for help. He did it alone in the early hours while the city slept, because for him, that was the greatest tribute he could leave behind. A visible, concrete reminder for anyone who passed through during the hottest or hardest days of life. And it didn't take long for that phrase to become a beacon. Visitors took photos beside it. Teachers brought entire classes to reflect on its meaning. Public speakers cited Eduardo as an example of non-institutional transformative leadership. But to him, none of that mattered as much as watching someone sit in the shade, eyes closed, relieved, breathing deeply after a suffocating day. That, to him, was victory. That was the real fruit of his story. Over time, the shelter was given a name. Not Eduardo's name, as many had suggested, but the name he chose, Seed Space. Because he knew names fade, plaques rust, awards are forgotten, but seeds, oh, seeds, they endure, even when the world seems barren, even when everything looks hopeless. And that's how his story lives on to this day, as a seed planted in concrete, watered by action, and protected by shade that isn't just shade, it's arms, it's bridges, it's gestures of care. Eduardo grew older, but never distanced himself. Even today, people sometimes find him there, sitting on a bench, observing the movement, jotting things down in a simple notebook, sometimes guiding a young person, sometimes just listening, always with the same calm as someone who knows true change doesn't make noise. It simply remains. And when asked if he's proud of what he built, he gives a crooked smile and says, "I didn't build anything. I just planted some ideas. The rest, you all made it happen." And perhaps deep down, that's the greatest lesson of his story, that no transformation starts out big. No respect is imposed. It's built, offered, nurtured, and when it's genuine, it spreads. Without credit, without a name, without a trophy. At the back of the shelter, between water jugs and shade made from old cloths, one simple phrase stood out as if it had been written with a soul. It's not just shade that brings relief, it's respect. Thick brush, black paint, white wall. But the strongest contrast wasn't in the colors. It was in the intention. Eduardo didn't ask for help to write it. He waited for nightfall, for the movement to stop, and alone, with calloused hands, wrote what he felt. No speech, no video, no audience. That phrase wasn't marketing. It was a manifesto. Pain turned into direction. And as with all things true, it didn't need to shout. It simply stayed. Quiet. Present. Deep. The phrase became an invisible tattoo on those who passed through. Everyone who touched that wall felt something different. Some thought of their mother. Others remembered an absent father. And some simply cried. It wasn't just physical heat that the shade eased. It soothed the fever of indifference. And in that improvised shelter, made of repurposed wood and patched tarps, some of the most human stories in that city were born. People who entered just to escape the sun and left seeing the world in a different light. Because shade, when it comes with dignity, also illuminates. What no one knew was what had gone on behind that gesture. Eduardo had already suffered 3 second-degree burns during the construction. He had been ignored by politicians, kicked out of a public square, and even fined for illegal occupation. But he kept going, because for him, stopping would mean accepting that the silence of the powerful was louder than the quiet cries of hunger, thirst, and burning skin on hot asphalt. And while the city argued over hashtags, he was building respect with his bare hands. 1 tarp a day, 1 glass of water at a time, 1 look for each person who arrived. The shelter still stands, but it's different now. Today it's a reference point. Children go there to learn about citizenship. University students visit to understand what climate justice looks like in practice. Teachers mention Eduardo in lectures on humanized urban planning. And, most symbolically, the city officially recognized the site, not as a shelter but as the Eduardo Nascimento community living space. Yes, the man who was once threatened by inspectors is now studied by architects and cited in institutional documents. Because when a story is made with truth, not even ignorance can erase it. But what touches people most is that Eduardo didn't change. He still wears the same worn cap, the same simple sandals, and carries the same gaze that blends strength and kindness. He didn't get dazzled. He didn't become a social media star or accept reality show invitations. He said no to sponsors and declined medals. I already have what I need, my community's respect. And when someone asks him the secret, he answers with the simplicity of someone who knows a lot. I just started. And that's when many people cry. Because they realize that the extraordinary lay in the ordinary, in doing, in getting up and starting, in not waiting. Today, young people from the area call him the Sun Professor. He doesn't teach with a board or a book, but every conversation with him is worth more than any diploma. He teaches about purpose, about empathy, about how each person can build their own shade for someone else. And from these conversations, new stories emerge. A girl who lost her grandmother decided to set up a hydration station at school. A young man who had been involved in drug trafficking now organizes neighborhood cleanup efforts. An elderly woman teaches crochet at the shelter and says she's found a new meaning for her life. All this started because someone decided not to wait for the government or for a miracle, just started. And the most impressive part? No one forgot Eduardo. Even after the heatwave passed. Even after social media influencers moved on to the next cause. Even after the TV reports stopped airing. His name still echoes. Not in headlines, but in conversations, in community gatherings, in the social projects he inspired, in the eyes of children who now know that respecting others doesn't come from a decree, but from a choice. And that, yes, is revolution. A revolution without a megaphone, but one that transforms quietly. In a world where everyone rushes to be seen, Eduardo taught the value of doing without needing to be noticed. He showed there is a nearly divine strength in those who build without applause, in those who plant shade without knowing if they'll live to feel the coolness. He became a symbol of something rare today: silent action, kindness without hidden agendas, coherence between words and deeds. And that's why his story became a reference, not for instant success, but for lasting impact. But maybe this story is only just beginning, because as long as there is heat on the streets, there will be thirst for respect. As long as there is institutional neglect, there will be thirst for dignity. And as long as there's someone like Eduardo willing to act, there will be hope. The question is, what about you? Will you wait until the heat reaches you? Will you keep believing you need a lot to get started? Or will you understand that, sometimes, the little you have is already enough to change someone's world? Maybe you're the next one to build some shade. Maybe you carry within you a phrase the world still needs to read. Maybe your small action is the starting point of great stories. But none of that will happen if you keep waiting for ideal conditions. Because the world changes when we act without guarantees, when we are truly bothered, when we turn indignation into action, just like Eduardo did. And now that you know this story, tell me honestly, how many times have you waited for someone else to take the lead before something could change? How many times have you frozen in front of a great idea because you thought you needed the perfect setup, a magical push or external approval? How many incredible stories have been shelved because you thought it wasn't the right time, or because one more detail was still missing? The truth is simple. If courage doesn't come from within, no external condition will ever be enough. Eduardo didn't have spotlights, public funds, a marketing team, or the backing of big institutions. He had scorching sun, dust in his eyes, and aching joints. But above all, he had attitude. While many pointed fingers at the government's failures, he pointed toward possible solutions, with shade, with dignity, with respect. We're not talking about movie heroes. We're talking about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because great stories don't start with applause. They start with restlessness. And maybe that restlessness is visiting you now. Maybe you're there with an idea bubbling in your chest, waiting for a perfect condition that never comes. Maybe you're waiting for more time, more support, more validation. But what if I told you the world doesn't need more paused plans? It needs more people in motion. Eduardo didn't wait. He acted with what he had. with whoever was around. And that's why his story is now told as a symbol of hope in times of neglect. It's not about building physical shelters. It's about building spaces of respect, of care, of presence. When he stretched a tarp between two old poles, he didn't just create shade. He created refuge. He created dignity. He created belonging. That became more than a shelter. It became an example. And when an example is born, it doesn't stay confined to where it began. It grows legs. It travels. It inspires. It transforms other stories. And suddenly one person's action becomes many people's awakening. Notice the details. No extraordinary resources were needed for change to begin. What was needed was sensitivity, empathy, and action. 3 ingredients every human being carries, but not everyone chooses to use. How many communities are out there burning under the heat of neglect, waiting for a gesture to begin a new story? How many elderly, how many children, how many invisible people could find relief if someone just stopped complaining and started acting? Now think, maybe that someone is you. Maybe you're reading this not by accident, but because your conscience was already restless and just needed a little push. Maybe you're about to write the story that will change someone's life. And it doesn't have to be grand, it has to be true. A community's turning point doesn't begin with millions of dollars. It begins with a gesture, an attentive look, I can help. Great stories don't ask for permission to exist. They simply begin. And you? How do you want to be remembered? As someone who pointed out problems and crossed their arms? Or as someone who picked up the shovel, the bucket, the tarp, and did things differently? The world doesn't need more couch critics. It needs more changemakers, more authors of stories that reshape the world instead of just commenting on it. Because every neighborhood, every city, every country improves when someone decides to act with purpose. And that someone can be you. You just need to stop waiting. Some people think transformation is distant, that only politicians, millionaires, or NGOs can make it happen. But the truth is that most of the stories that changed the world began with simple people doing what they could, where they were, without fanfare, without applause, without guarantees. The difference? They began. And that's the verb you need to embrace. Begin. Begin small. Begin imperfect. Begin scared even. But begin. Because when you begin, the universe responds. Doors open. Good people show up. What once seemed impossible starts to take shape. And what was once just an idea becomes a movement. And movement, my friend, is what transforms the world. Eduardo didn't start a revolution alone, but he sparked it. And a spark, in times of darkness, is worth more than 1,000 speeches. Your story doesn't need to be grand, it just needs to be lit. And if this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself, because feelings that aren't shared are lost. Ideas that aren't spread die. Actions that don't inspire become lonely efforts. So share it, comment, send it to someone who needs it, because you never know who's in need of a push today. And if a story has the power to awaken someone, it has already fulfilled a transformative role. And if you want to keep receiving content like this, if you want to be part of a community that believes in the power of stories to raise awareness, spark change, and inspire action, then subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. We're not looking for followers. We're looking for allies. People who feel, who reflect, who act, who understand that every time they listen to a story like this, they're one step closer to unlocking their own potential. You might think you're alone, that no one cares, that your ideas have no power. But don't be fooled. Every gesture of yours is being observed by someone. Every action you take could be the push someone else needs. Every story of yours might light up someone still lost in the dark. And even if no one applauds, even if no one sees, the transformation happens. First in you, then in the world. That's how it works. So tell me, are you ready to be remembered as someone who acted, or as someone who waited, as the author of a story, or as a background character in someone else's? Do you want to be remembered as someone who pointed out problems, or as someone who built solutions? The answer is already inside you. And if it's already beginning to beat, then don't waste time. Go outside. Observe, listen, feel, and do. Because the world needs fewer spectators and more protagonists. Start with what you have, with whoever's around, with the courage already living inside you. The greatest stories have always started that way. And maybe yours is just waiting for one decision to be born.